Hey, hello everybody. This is Dr. Babcock. We are on George Orwell today. Um, uh, we're going to be talking about his essay Politics and the English Language. A couple notes on who this guy is, what he did before we jump into our topic. His name is Eric Blair. George Orwell is a pen name. He is best known these days for two novels, Animal Farm and 1984, which high school students do read and should read and are incredible, and everyone on earth should have to read 1984. And Animal Farm, because they speak to the worst tragedies of the 20th century, which have to be totalitarian governments. We all talk about, we all know about, everyone teaches about Hitler, who was an absolute monster, which you're probably taught, I hope, if you're in my class. I take every opportunity to tell every student. Hitler killed 11 million people, 6 million Jews died in the Holocaust. And then if you want to account for World War II itself, it's something like 80 million people, soldiers and civilians, died in that war, which he really did cause. I mean, there are very few wars where you can pin down, here's the one guy that caused that war. In World War II, without Hitler, almost certainly wouldn't have happened, at least not at the scale that it did. Hitler's an absolute monster. What I always tell my students, though, is that if you just look in terms of like body counts, if the question is, who killed the most of their own people? Okay, if we set aside war, which you might not want to do, which is fine, but if the question is, who was the most tyrannical to their own people, Hitler is third, Stalin is second, and Mao Zedong is number one. And this is something that George Orwell is interested, especially in. He's interested in Stalin. He's interested in the way that the Soviet system evolved. Okay, why is he so interested in this? Because he is an avowed socialist. He says of himself, all my writing for the past decade, he says at one point, all my writing has been against totalitarianism and for democratic socialism, against totalitarianism and for democratic socialism. So his problem with the socialists in China, his problem with the socialists in Cuba, Soviet Union, is that they weren't democratic. They were too totalitarian. Okay. Again, as I've expressed to you, if you've been in my class before, I think that this view is naive. Why do I think that? Let me throw a few quotes in front of you, but before I do that, let me give you the basics of Animal Farm in 1984, which are these. Animal Farm is an allegory for specifically the rise of the Soviet Union, the overthrow of the monarchy in Russia, and the rise of the Soviets, of the communist Soviets. In Orwell's view, this was a good cause, certainly. The old regime was plenty oppressive. There's no historical doubt about that. What happened in history, though, was that Lenin, Stalin were going to turn around and make the Romanovs look like angels. And just in terms of how many people both Lenin and Stalin would liquidate. I don't have time to walk you through, but look it up. Sometimes Lenin gets held up as an okay dude. But it was Stalin who was the real problem. Stalin was worse, but Lenin was no good guy, unless you think it's okay to murder your enemies. If you're okay with murdering your enemies, your political dissidents and enemies and that sort of thing. And I'm not even talking about war. I'm talking about while you're in power, if you're okay with hanging and shooting people that disagree with you, then Lenin's an okay guy. Okay, so Animal Farm is an outline, and it's pretty one-to-one. There's like the Trotsky character, there's the Stalin character, the Lenin character, and so on. The working class is represented by the horses. The dogs are something like the KGB, the enforcement, the cops. So each kind of animal on the farm is representative of a certain group of Russians. Okay, so it's pretty one-to-one allegory. He calls it himself a fairy tale, but it's meant to, with clear eyes, look at exactly what went wrong and how wrong it went in the Soviet Union. And to us now, from the perspective of the 21st century, we know this stuff. This is unproblematic. Well, in the 1940s, there were pro-Stalin, pro-communist intellectuals in Britain and in America at the time that just would not see, were not willing to deal with the facts on the ground. Okay, so many intellectuals in Britain, they saw it happened in Spain. They saw what the communists did in Spain, who were against Franco. Franco, the fascists, ultimately beat the communists, but the communists, Auden, W.H. Auden, sees what the communists are doing, how they're treating their enemies, and he quits. He's like, okay, if this is communism, I don't need it. Many intellectuals did that, but then you had some that were just clinging on to communism and couldn't abide the reality of what the Soviet Union actually was and how they were actually treating people. And if you, again, the tour de force on this has got to be Solzhenitsyn, his autobiographical work, Gulag Archipelago, where he himself was very pro-communist, and he outlines his time in the Gulag, the prison camp, the concentration camp, where he was half starved to death, and walks you through exactly how Russia got to where it got. So for this reason, students ought to know the history of communism, and Animal Farm is just a key text, and it's a lot easier to read than Gulag Archipelago. It's a lot shorter, and it's a lot more appealing. Is entertaining the right word to use in this context? But it is more appealing and more accessible. Maybe is a better word there. 1984. Written in 1948, published in, he just flipped the two numbers there, but published in 49. Similar kind of thing to Animal Farm, but it's much more realistic. It's not some fairy tale, it's the real world. It's there's future technology, future for 48, like past for us. They're talking to screens. Who could believe such a world where people were talking to screens and getting phone calls through their television? Imagine such a thing. And it's the story of totalitarianism plus technology, and just, it's a horror story because it's real. The thing about 1984 is that, again, it's a future. It's science fiction. It's set in the future. Really, it's describing the past. It's describing what had already been the case in the Soviet Union. The total violation of the norms of language, of the norms. Certain things you're allowed to say and think, certain things you're not allowed to say or think. These are thought crimes. So many of we have terms that get thrown around these days that George Orwell invented in 1984. There's a slew of them. Memory hole, when we just collectively decide to forget something, that goes in the memory hole. Somebody is unpersoned. It's as if someone no longer exists. The main character, his job is to unperson people, remove them from history. Stalin, before there was Photoshop, there was Stalin. We know that he had people edit former friends and current people that fell afoul of Stalin, and he had shot or hung. He would literally have an artist shop them out, like manually paint over them, take them out of photographs. So it really, it's supposed to be futuristic. It's really, and it is that, but it can also be understood to be a representation, like Animal Farm, of what was really going on and how terrible life was under the oppressive regime in the Soviet Union. Amidst all this, George Orwell remains a democratic socialist. Okay, I said that I consider him this to be. Whoops, where am I going? Here am I. Yeah, there we are. Nope. We're here. I consider this to be naive. Why? Okay, so the best, someone will say, what about Sweden? What about the Scandinavian states? Don't we see democratic socialism there? And it's like, well, define socialism. If socialism is the seizure of the means of production, okay, that's the Marxist formulation. When the proletariats, when the working people decide to take from the business owners, from the bourgeoisie, from the let's say a factory, when the people who work in the factory decide that the factory belongs to them and get rid of the factory owner, the bourgeois factory owner, and to enjoy all of the fruits of their labor. Okay, we're not going to give a portion to the business owner anymore. We're going to keep this for ourselves, and we're going to work for ourselves now. If that is socialism, then Scandinavia is not socialist. What do I mean by that? I mean that it is a market economy. I mean that the government does not set prices for things the way it did in the Soviet Union, the way it did in Maoist China. Okay, but maybe that's not your definition of socialism. Maybe your definition of socialism is, well, there is a free market economy. People are free to spend their money as they wish. Again, in a Marxist economy, the only free market is the black market. That is, it's illegal to trade, and it is. If you look at Cuba, it is illegal to work for money. That's not a joke. It is illegal to work for money. I could tell you stories. Anyway, if democratic socialism means something like Bernie Sanders says, which is the expansion of government programs. Look at Britain, their National Health Service, NHS. If that's socialism, and perhaps to George Orwell that was socialism. That's one thing. That is an expanded government program, expanded compared to us. Okay, in the U.S. An expanded government program that is paid for by taxes. Okay, is paid for by the people. No quotes. The people. I don't know why I put quotes around that. Who are taxed? The citizens who are taxed. And this goes into the government coffers. The government pays for all of healthcare and so on. Those are socialist policies that exist in a free market. Okay, so is that socialism? Who are you asking? Are you asking Karl Marx? No. Are you asking Bernie Sanders? I think so. I think that's, he would say yes to that. Are you asking George Orwell? I don't know. There you go. Here, let me walk you through exactly why I am a little, more than a little skeptical of George Orwell's views. He's so broad that he makes everyone happy and he ticks everyone off. No matter like where you are politically, he has something to say that you like, and he has something to say that'll irk you. So here's where he irks me. Okay. He says this of the colonial system. He was born into the colonial system. His dad was an administrator in India, where Orwell was born. And listen to what he has to say about the colonial policy of the British Empire in India. The government of all the Indian provinces under the control of the British Empire is of necessity despotic, because only the threat of force can subdue a population of several million subjects. You see this? Because there are just so many people to rule over, we have to be despots if we're gonna rule them. If the British Empire is going to control India, that is necessarily despotism, which he hates, which, good, rightfully hates. That is tyranny, right? When you rule over people who do not want to be ruled over, as nice as you may look, as well-meaning as you may be, if that's not the definition of tyranny, I don't know what that word is for. Okay, so Orwell, I think, is correct here. Now, here's the problem. Okay, Mao Zedong says this, and this is a real quote from history. Mao Zedong, of course, is the chairman of the Communist Party in China during much of the 20th century. He says, among other things, he said a lot, but he says this: the farmers want freedom, we want socialism. Okay. Here's the problem, the agriculture problem. Marx is always talking about in the manifesto, he's always talking about labor, specifically factory labor. This is the Industrial Revolution. To Marx's mind, communism is the best remedy for the problems brought on by a new industrial world. Okay. But you run up against, in my opinion, inevitably run up against the agrarian problem. Okay, so with this COVID stuff, right, with this plague that we're in, if you watch any news clips about rural America, you're going to hear the word self-reliance like 50 times. We rely on ourselves around here. We're not panic buying because we already have 10,000 rolls of toilet paper. Like we go to Sam's Club or whatever twice a year, and we just buy a pallet of toilet paper, and that's how we live. Before this crisis or after it or whatever. Self-reliance. Okay. What does communism? What does socialism? And I mean like Marxist socialism, not the kind of in a free market, but the kind that abolishes the free market. What does this have to offer farm laborers, okay, who want to be self-reliant, who don't want to rely on the government? As Mao had this problem. He couldn't get the farmers on board with him, so he had to use force. The farmers want freedom. The farmers want to be self-reliant. The farmers don't want to rely on the state. But of course, the big cities rely on farms. Of course they do, because everyone's got to eat, right? This seems to be a trend. You go to the rural places today in America today. These are very, tend to be conservative people who want to rely on themselves, who are very skeptical of government, which they, in their heads means big city, and then they're skeptical of big city people. They just want to do their own thing and not be bothered. Okay. Communism is going to bother farmers. They need the rice, they need the grain, they need the meat. Okay. What does this have to do with what Orwell just said? Of necessity, a Marxist socialist economy, one that seizes the means of production, needs also to seize the farm. So if you have a farmer who owns his own land, government needs that land. It's ours now. This too, I would argue, is of necessity despotic. When you seize the means of production, we all think of the monopoly man, like this fat cat on Wall Street. Well, what about farmers who own their own land? Well, the aristocrats owned all the land. Even in China, there were farmers who owned their own land. Yes, there were aristocrats who were maybe fat cats. Okay, I'm not saying there wasn't oppression. I will never say there wasn't depression before communism, but communism assured oppression. Look in, Google it, right? Okay, so I think the history shows that, like the British Empire's necessary despotism, real Marxism entails necessary despotism, or at least dictatorship. And you know who agrees with me on that? Karl Marx. Straight from the horse's mouth. This is not doctored. This is Karl Marx. Type this into your Google, hit enter, see if he said this. Okay, so here's Marx. The class struggle which the class struggle necessarily leads to the dictatorship of the proletariat, which will precede finally, those are my words, a transition to the abolition of all classes. So what's Marx saying here? He's saying that Marx sees history is the class struggle, the struggle of the oppressors and the oppressed. That is the story of history, okay? No more, no less, for Marx. And, give the devil his due here, right? Like any point in history, you're going to find oppression and people suffering under it. Now, the struggle, so the fight back, as we proletariats fight back against those who own everything, the bourgeoisie, inevitably we're going to come to a period of the dictatorship of the proletariat. He wants dictatorship. Now, it's a transition period, okay? It won't last forever, says Marx. And this is where he's just off his rocker. How many dictators have you ever heard of that were just like, you know what? Do I need to keep dictating? You know what? Maybe I'll just give it up. Let's name one. Gorbachev. Is Gorbachev a dictator who he sort of oversaw the dissolution of the Soviet Union. Was it out of the kindness of his heart? Was he like, you know what? I just want to kind of give up power. No, he saw that the states were breaking up from the Soviet Union. Soviet Union is not just Russia. It was a union of other countries, such as Georgia. He saw that this was happening anyway. He saw that his breadlines were getting way too long, that he couldn't provide all the things that communism promises to provide. And so he knew which way the wind was blowing. He didn't make the choice in a vacuum that, you know what, let's get a little bit more liberal in our policies. No, he just saw what was going to happen anyway, and may have, forestalled a civil war or something like this. Okay, so I think Marx is off his rocker if he thinks that once the dictatorship obtains, once Lenin gets into power, okay, then we'll just transition to the abolition of all classes. What happens at Animal Farm? The pigs finally get in power. They institute their own rule, and what happens? What's the end of Animal Farm? The pigs start walking on two legs. Okay, the pigs have grown fat. They're starting to look more and more like the drunken humans that they got rid of and took over from. Okay, the oppressees have become the oppressors. That is the end of Animal Farm. That was what happened in the Soviet Union. I agree with Marx that period of dictatorship is inevitable. I disagree with him. I think he insanely misreads human nature when he thinks that the dictators will just naturally transition to give up, to share power. Like, that doesn't happen without force or the threat thereof. Okay, so much for the politics of George Orwell and my own. Onward to the politics in the English language. Okay, so if you're hunting for a thesis, which was a discussion question I gave you, and I'm going to answer it myself. If you're hunting for a thesis in the politics of the English language, here's a couple good candidates. And this is all Orwell's quotes from the essay. So, the English language, quote, becomes ugly and inaccurate because our thoughts are foolish, but the slovenliness of our language makes it easier for us to have foolish thoughts. In other words, same thing said differently, he says this later. If thoughts corrupt language, language can also corrupt thought. And so people start speaking foolishly because they're thinking foolishly, and people start thinking foolishly because they're speaking foolishly. The illustration he gives, he compares the plight of the English language to a guy who maybe fails at work, maybe gets fired, and so he starts drinking. And because he's drinking, he fails harder, and because he fails harder, he starts, it's this vicious cycle, right? What's the main culprit here? Why is what's so bad about the English language? It's vague. It is becoming vague. It doesn't have to be vague. He's sort of optimistic about, you can change language. People have done this before. The journalists get together, writers get together, and start making fun of certain terms of phrase. And Orwell was somewhat successful in this. Some of the things he criticizes, such as the not-un formation. I woke up this morning and saw the sun not unlike the Flowers in the morning, so were the sun rays. Like, not unlike, he just thought it was stupid and unnecessary. And no one really says that anymore except as a joke. So he successfully sort of was a part of like quashing this stupid turn of phrase. Anyway, his main problem is with vague language. As an English professor, like, more power to you, I get it. Why do people speak vaguely? Because they don't know what they're talking about, okay? He says this, as soon as certain topics are raised, the concrete melts into the abstract. People stop talking about real things going on and start talking about ideas. The whole tendency of modern prose, again, is away from concreteness. For the sake of concreteness, let me give you some examples. The first one's mine, then we're going to look at one of his examples of the corruption of the English language, especially with regard to politics. Here's a tweet. This tweet is a real tweet that I just pulled from this weekend. So again, if you're watching today, hello, good luck, stay healthy. If you're watching at some point in the future, I hope you can keep the electricity going and the water running in the new post-apocalyptic world. So this is the governor of Michigan, okay? And what happened is she looks like she overreached. Anyway, she ticked a lot of people off in just how far she wanted the lockdown, the quarantine to go. Some people thought that she just pushed it too far, unlike many of the other states around her. Anyway, and this is whether she did or she didn't. I haven't been following it that closely, to be honest. But I don't live in Michigan. I don't know. Anyway, here was her response to what's going on. She says this: "We are living in a difficult time, and the unknown is scary. But I do know that we must remain steady. We can't allow fear or panic to guide us. The lives of Michiganders are at stake. We must stay the course to save lives. Stay steady. We're going to get through this together." What does that mean? What does that mean? We're going to get through this together. Like, literally, think with me about this. We're going to get through this together. What's the alternative? The alternative would be splitting apart. Okay. What is she afraid of? Splitting apart. Does she think that the state of Michigan is going to dissolve? Does she think that people are going to remove themselves from their friends and family, which is literally what she has told them to do, to self-quarantine? Like, we're going to get through that. That's one of these things that politicians say, like, we're going to stand shoulder to shoulder. Like, what does that mean? What does that actually mean? So politics will say things like Americans know that, and then fill in the blank X. Like what? As if Americans are 100% like in agreement on this issue. Like when they say Americans know that, what they're really saying is I think that, and then fill in the blank. Partner with is a new favorite of mine. Partner, it's more vague than. Someone, for example, when it became clear that we were going online, so many companies coming out of the woodwork sending WBU emails saying, we'd love to partner with you. What they're trying to say, if they were more honest, what they would be saying is, we would love for you to hire us to help you make the transition to online learning. But no, partner with. Like, oh, that sounds nice. Well, it's just more vague. It's just less precise. It's less honest, okay? So this is an example of exactly the kind of thing that Orwell hated. This is all abstract. Okay, the unknown is scary. Unknown is an abstract concept. Scary is an abstract concept. As opposed to what? As opposed to if she tweeted, look, for the next 3 days, okay, I know what 3 days means. I'm going to ask you to not gather in groups more than 10. Okay, we're putting some numbers on this. We're putting some specifics on this. Something like that. You know, our death toll today in Michigan is such and such a number. Tomorrow will be such and such a number. But if we do this, we might bring it down to another number. You know, why do politicians do this? Why do they say things that are meaningless? Why, you know, this is exactly what we hate about politicians. They must be smart enough to know that and they are intelligent people usually. they must be smart enough to know that we hate this kind of thing out of them. Why do they keep doing this vague stuff? Because they feel like they have to talk, and the second they say something specific, they know they're going to be held accountable for that specific utterance. So the only, the best defense of the politician is vagueness. Okay. So here is an example this is Orwell himself. Okay, and he's talking about the kind of language that he hates, and he's going to give us an example of he's sort of parodying. He writes his own parody of a verse from the Bible. One of my absolute favorite verses, by the way. I love that he picks this. Like, George Orwell, you're the best. Never change, except in your politics. So let's look at we're going to start with the bad version, the version he made up, and then we're going to look at the original good version of this verse. Okay, so I'm going to read this. The bad version, Ecclesiastes 9:11. Objective consideration of contemporary phenomena compels the conclusion that success or failure in competitive activities exhibits no tendency to be commensurate with innate capacity, but that a considerable element of the unpredictable must invariably be taken into account. Doesn't that sound nice and academic? Like, what a guy. Like, how intelligent of him to write that. Let's look at the original translation. I returned and saw under the sun that the race is not to the swift, nor the battle to the strong, neither yet bread to the wise, nor riches to men of understanding, nor yet favor to men of skill, but time and chance happeneth to them all. Which, by the way, is a fact. The race is not to the swift. The battle is not to the strong. Like, anyone who lived through 2016 with their eyes open has seen this. No outcome is guaranteed. As somebody, a lot of my friends getting through grad school and looking for jobs, let me tell you, it's not necessarily the best and the brightest who get a job. I am living proof that sometimes idiots find places too. So, but in all seriousness, I'm thinking of specific people who I thought were just absolutely brilliant, who didn't end up with academic jobs, and then people who I thought were maybe not the strongest did. This is life. Anyway, back to the verse at hand. Objective consideration of contemporary phenomena. If there's any way, George Orwell says, to use shorter words, use shorter words. If there's any way to bring the abstract, okay, contemporary phenomena. What are the contemporary phenomena? Like, what are you talking about? That's vague. Look at the King James here. I believe this is King James. The race is not to the swift. I know what the race is, and I know what the swift runner is. Nor the battle to the strong. I know what those things are. Neither yet bread to the wise. Okay, these are all concrete images. Bread, I know what that is. Phenomena, that means so many things. That could mean anything, okay? So the problem is vagueness, and the problem with vagueness is insincerity. The great enemy of clear language is insincerity. So, couldn't agree more on that note. Orwell. I want to end with his, he gives us 6 rules for better writing. He just lays it out in the end of this essay. So we'll just go through these. Number 1, never use a metaphor, simile, or other figure of speech which you're used to seeing in print. This is what he calls a dead metaphor, one that feels like you're beating a dead horse. See what I did? I used one. Beating a dead horse, this is something you heard of. It's something that, do you really think about beating a dead horse? I hope not. It's kind of gross. But stay away from these dead metaphors. Look at the metaphors that he himself uses. He says that Latinate diction, that is terms from Latin or terms from Greek, he says fall like snow on the meaning of sentences, obscuring them and blurring them. Okay, falling like snow, I know what that means. And so he's talking about how some types of language obscure real meaning. He talks about tea leaves stopping up a sink, the bad, useless words stopping the flow of meaning, tea leaves gathering in a sink. That's not a dead metaphor. I haven't read that anywhere except for Orwell. So his metaphors, he does this well. He does this very well. He uses metaphors that he came up with. And this is better than just scrounging for terms of phrase. And by the way, the phrase, this is another big area of his. He thinks that instead of hunting for precise words, we hunt for vague phrases. He would rather us find good words than continue to utilize bad, prefabricated phrases. Okay, never use a long one where a short one will do. We just saw that in Ecclesiastes. Bread and wise, nice short words. Phenomena, consideration, commensurate. Long words that, cloud meaning. Okay, if it is possible to cut a word out, always cut it out. Boy, that's good writing. Almost all the time. Consider, by the way, how far we've come from Samuel Johnson, who was always Latinate and always using a bunch of words. It's like, I just want to chime in here and say, though these rules are good for today, these rules will change, and in 50 years, I imagine that these rules will be useless. Tastes will have changed. But for now, I do think that these mostly do stand because they're in service of clarity, and we still need clarity because people, especially political writers, do not like clarity. They do not want to be held accountable. They want to stir up emotion. They don't want to think through, broadly speaking, they don't want to think through specific ideas. Of course, you can find counterexamples, thank God, of political writers who will still do this. But can you think of anyone who doesn't fall into this trap? Occasionally. Never use passive where you can use the active. This is something in my writing classes I always say. This is something that was drilled into my head. Active is always more descriptive because in the passive you can obfuscate. Hey Trevor, did you eat the cookies that I laid out for the kids? The cookies were eaten. Okay, see what I did? I didn't say I ate the cookies. I said the cookies were eaten. The passive voice, the cookies are eaten, takes the subject out of the picture. The cookies were eaten. It's more vague. Mistakes were made. Famously, Bush said this. Mistakes were made. By whom, George Bush, is the question. So perfect example of bad political speech. Mistakes were made. Okay, what a weaselly way to say that, right? Never use a foreign phrase, a scientific word, or jargon if you can think of an everyday English equivalent. You get too scientific sounding, you get too jargony. In English, this is the mistake we love to make in English. We love jargon. Why? Because it situates us in the in-group. We understand the jargon. You stupid, uneducated people don't get our jargon. So, sorry. Always avoid jargon if you can at all. And then 6, break any of these rules sooner than say anything outright barbarous. And this is all verbatim, by the way. This is not my paraphrase. These are his words exactly. I would never say barbarous. So all these rules can be broken if in observing these rules you say something that just is an awful sentence, like go ahead and break the rule, use the dead metaphor, use the passive voice if you absolutely must. I did see use of the passive voice by Orwell himself. So, and so it is with rules of writing. This is not science. This is an art. Rules, we need some flexibility, and Orwell is astute enough to recognize that. So there you go. Political writing, politics in the English language. Orwell, we have need for you now. I hope this helps. I think these rules are generally good. We will see you next time, folks.